Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tran Mendez, and I'm an academic trainer with the Center for Teaching and Learning. And today we have Marisha Kelly and Amanda Bizette from the library here with us today. And they're going to be going over engaging with information literacy. Just a couple of housekeeping items. I am currently recording this session, and I will post it in the faculty resource area by the end of today. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will make sure your questions are answered. And with that, I will turn it over to Marisha and Amanda.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Engaging with Information Literacy. This is the first in a series of presentations focusing on the Association for College and Research Libraries Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. We hope that by the end of this presentation, you will consider yourself an authority on the frame idea, authority is constructed and contextual. My name is Marisha Kelly, and I'm a reference and instruction librarian, and I've been with NCU Library for about a year.
And my name is Amanda Bizette. I'm also a reference and instruction librarian, and I've been with NCU since January 2013. So let's go ahead and get started. Like Marisha said, when we're talking about information literacy, we're associating that with the ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education. And in that, they have 6 interconnected core concepts with flexible options for implementation. So today, of course, we are focusing on authority is constructed and contextual. And faculty can integrate these concepts when designing curricula and assignments that foster enhanced engagement with the core ideas about information and scholarship within their disciplines. Now, this particular frame, authority is constructed and contextual, I do want to emphasize that ACRL does not list them in order of operation or order of importance. They're simply listed in alphabetical order. And that's because the frames are all interconnected. And research is a continuous and evolving process, and the frames can be applied throughout information creation. So we will see as we go along in this series how a lot of the frames overlap with one another. And just to broadly define or talk about authority, we're talking about that in regards to who is the creator of that information. Are they qualified to write about that? Who's the author? Who's the publisher? Are they reputable? Do they have specific expertise and knowledge? And we will soon see as we go along in this presentation that that is a very, very simplistic way of thinking about an authority. And there are a lot of other factors to consider as it relates to authority. Now, this next slide, I am actually going to read it word for word because these are ACRL's exact words on this particular frame. Authority is constructed and contextual. So information resources reflect their creators' expertise and credibility and are evaluated based on the information need and the context in which the information will be used. Authority is constructed in that various communities may recognize different types of authority. It is contextual in that the information may help to determine the level of authority required. So again, that is the exact wording of this particular frame. We're going to break this down just a little bit more. And I'm not going to read all of this word for word, but ACRL goes on to describe how novice researchers and experts come to understand this concept of authority. Experts understand that authority is a type of influence recognized or exerted within a community. They understand the need to determine the validity of the information created by different authorities and to acknowledge biases that privilege some sources of authority over others, especially in terms of others' worldviews, gender, sexual orientation, and cultural orientation. So I think that this part is very, very important because it tells us that, you know, when we're thinking about authority, the authority of a source, we're not coming at that without any, it's not objective. In other words, we do have those biases based on our own experiences. Also, experts view authority with an attitude of informed skepticism. So informed skepticism is something we'll hear time and time again as it relates to authority. And an openness to new perspectives, additional voices, and changes in schools of thought. They know how to seek authoritative voices, but also recognize that unlikely voices can be authoritative depending on need. And I also think that this is extremely important because it's a level of, it's sort of a higher level of evaluation instead of just, oh, I'm going to use a peer-reviewed source, always that's safe. You know, experts can recognize that other sources can also be authoritative based on that particular need and context. And this all comes from the frame itself as well. So ACRL goes on to describe this information in a narrative form, and this is how we have presented it. So now that we've actually talked about what the frame is, and we've broken it down just a little bit, let's talk about why it matters, right? Why do we care about authority? We might say, well, we care because we have to cite authoritative sources and make sure we back up information, but that's really not the extent of it. You know, why are we doing that? So I've put a few bullet points here on why authority does matter. And on a very basic level, it helps students to recognize sources that may promote fake news, conspiracy theories, or hidden agendas. So this could help them to avoid a potentially embarrassing situation, right, if they were to cite one of these sources in their own research. On the other hand, it helps them being able to effectively evaluate authority, helps them to avoid excluding quality sources, even if not peer-reviewed or considered authoritative in a sort of traditional means or manner. And I have a quote from some researchers, Hoffer, Hannick, and Townsend, who say that by passively conforming to dominant authorities, students lose the chance to uncover meaningful alternatives that are no less valuable or reliable. So I thought that they put that in a really powerful way, that, you know, it's not so black and white, peer review versus non-peer review, especially in the context of a particular subject or research paper. Being able to effectively evaluate authority produces higher quality citations for research papers, theses, and dissertations. And in turn, that provides, basically gives a better reputation to North Central University. I know one thing that I like is when I am looking through ProQuest dissertations and theses and I see completed dissertations from NCU students. Looking at those references, they're using a lot of quality sources. And this is sort of in opposition to some of the other dissertations that I've seen in there, even from very reputable state schools. I'll go in and look at their references and see that there's just a lot of online sources that I'm not necessarily sure about. So I feel like NCU has very high quality citations in their research papers, their dissertations, their theses, and that makes me feel proud to work for this institution. Additionally, when we think about authority, students actually need to establish their own credibility with their professors, with their dissertation chairs, and ultimately with the scholarly community. So while they're thinking about the authority of their sources, they're also building their own authority. So especially if they're going to go on and publish within their field, it's very, very important. The next bullet point, I actually have a quote there from Younger and Orozco, who state that as working professionals and returning learners, BSIT, which is their Bachelor of Science in Infotech, BSIT students routinely work with different types of authority in their field. So I think that that's also very, very applicable to our students as well. You know, they're pretty much non-traditional. They're not really coming right from undergraduate study. And so because of that perspective, they are working with a broad variety of authorities in their field, in their work, in their academics. Finally, authority matters because of the ACRL dispositions. And we're going to see that on the next screen. The ACRL dispositions are also part of the frame itself. And they're a set of attitudes or tendencies. More specifically, they act almost as desired learning outcomes for the frame. And I say almost because there are no learning outcomes for the frame. It is not prescriptive. The framework is not prescriptive. And I am actually going to read this because I think all of these are extremely important. Again, this is word for word from ACRL. Learners who are developing their information abilities develop and maintain an open mind when encountering varied and sometimes conflicting perspectives, motivate themselves to find authoritative sources, recognizing that authority may be conferred or manifested in unexpected ways, develop awareness of the importance of assessing content with a skeptical stance and with a self-awareness of their own biases and worldview. They question traditional notions of granting authority and recognize the value of diverse ideas and worldviews. They're conscious that maintaining these attitudes and actions requires frequent self-evaluation. So I think that we can see here that these dispositions, while they are part of the framework itself, they don't only apply to academic research, right? They can apply to everyday life, especially as it relates to being an informed citizen of the world. And in fact, some might argue, I might argue, that if we were to observe all of these dispositions in our own life, that the world could be a better place, especially as it relates to all of those diversity issues. And finally, to sort of summarize why authority matters, we have a quote from Valerie Nye. She's a librarian who has written for the Intellectual Freedom blog. And this was interesting because Marisha and I both found this quote independent of one another and thought it was important to include in the presentation. Authority is constructed and contextual has become, for me, she says, the strongest frame integrating judgment and academic freedom into a research concept. It is the frame that allows individuals, disciplines, and cultural groups to privilege the information within their context of valued knowledge. It allows a student, researcher, and/or faculty member to define and justify authority based on the research topic. So I feel like this quote really emphasizes the freedom that's involved with selecting and choosing your sources, which is something to celebrate. So now that we've talked about what the frame is itself, broken it down a little bit, we've talked about why it matters. Let's talk about some of this scholarly research and how do librarians view authority and students. So in terms of the librarian perspective, there was a study in 2010 by Hoffer, Townsend, and Brunetti. They surveyed 59 librarians who taught information literacy sessions, and they wanted to get from them what are the key concepts or big ideas that students are struggling with in terms of authority. And so respondents cited, the librarian respondent cited the difficulty students encounter when evaluating a source's authority. According to respondents, when students see something written, whether on the page or on the screen, they often assume the author is qualified to write about it. So some of their more specific findings, they say that the librarians reported that they had trouble with, the students had trouble with the quality of information sources, especially digital natives. They're shockingly naive, are their words, about what they read on the internet and have little idea of quality control of sources. Another thing that they stressed is that today's online culture may sort of encourage that all opinions are right or appropriate or valid. So basically librarians are observing that students are having trouble with authority. And so what do the students say about it? Let's see what the student perspective is. There was a 2015 study by Rachel Scott who looked at freshmen at the University of Memphis, and she specifically asked them about authority. And so she asked them, how does authority relate to research? And she found that students' responses revealed that authority can be a charged and confusing word. Most responses reveal a nascent understanding of the meaning of authority implied by this frame. So she asked them, how does authority relate to research? And so these students couldn't, well, not that they couldn't articulate, but it was sort of a varied response. So some of them said authority is the person, assigning research. Some said it's legal authority. Some of them said it's relating to permissions while conducting research. Some of them did say that authority is related to the discipline. And then some of them had other responses, but none of them questioned authority, and none of them stated a preference for diversity in views. So she did find that it was sort of a confusing subject for students. She went on to ask, how can you evaluate an author's authority? And those responses were pretty varied as well, but they did have some good ideas. The next quote there is from the authors Hoffer, Lynn, Hannock, and Townsend. They say that students working with the authority threshold concept at the basic level should be reminded that authority is a slippery, complex, ever-shifting monster of an idea. Confusion and uncertainty are natural reactions when evaluating authority. And struggling with this threshold does not speak to a student's academic competence or aptitude. So it's not like they missed the class in undergraduate or graduate, like it's not that they're incompetent. It is, they are confirming this is a very difficult concept to grapple with. And I think it's important for all of us to remember that when we're working with students. Those researchers, Hoffer et al., they go on to say that much of success with evaluating authority just comes from experience. So the more these students are taking classes in their discipline, the more they're reading, the more they are taking classes, the easier evaluating authority will become for them. And they also say that librarians can be a powerful shortcut in the meantime as they're developing these skills.
So looking more at the student perspective, so a lot of the questions that trickle in to the library staff from NCU students often include whether something is quote unquote a good source, which is the right database to research a particular topic, and whether or not that particular source is peer-reviewed or scholarly. So the question here is, how do we as faculty and staff respond to these questions, knowing that defining authority, evaluating information can be somewhat confusing and troublesome, right? So really we have to encourage students to evaluate and question. And this is where authority is contextual comes in, right? So it all depends on not only what the information is, but what does that information mean and how does it apply to my research concept? And here's a quote from Wadey and Crow. They say that we have to combat dualistic thinking. So going beyond that type of yes or no source evaluation. So is this a good source? Yes or no? I mean, we have to evaluate it. It's not an easy question to answer. And it goes back to, reinforcing that there is no right or wrong way to do research. Again, it's not that students are doing anything wrong, but they're kind of falling into this spectrum between novice and expert, right? Depending on the topic, depending on the context of the information that they're reviewing. And over here, we have a poster from Bucknell University, kind of going through the life of identifying the authority of a particular resource. But again, it goes beyond asking those yes or no questions. So how do we determine the credibility of a source? What makes this particular source authoritative? What points of view is this source missing? Whose voice does the information represent? And on the converse, whose voice aren't we hearing, right? So again, it goes beyond the context and moves into that contextual realm. And so on this next slide here, these responses are actually from a module from the UC Davis library, and it asks the students 3 questions, and these are some of the varying responses, but again, a very black and white, a dualistic view of what authority is. So I know information is authoritative when I can verify the information in other places, the sources the topic adds are reliable, when it's written by a scholar. To me, someone is an authority on a subject when they have a degree in the subject, when they have written and published work on the subject. And then the last bullet point here, I am less likely to trust information when there is no publisher, when it's based on opinion instead of facts, when it comes from Wikipedia. So again, very simplistic answers to authority, right? And there was a study that was published in 2018 by Jankowski, Rusko, and Townsend, and they found that when armed with library checklists or tools, students can easily differentiate between popular and scholarly sources. However, you know, checklists don't allow students to critically think about their sources and that context of authority, right? So why am I using this source? What information from it is really, really critical to my research topic? And here we have a quote from Rebecca Kuchlis, who's a faculty member at the University of Colorado, and kind of defining the faculty perspective. And I think it really summarizes, you know, what we often think about when we're trying to relay skills related to authority. So she says, I was really trepidatious about the framework at first and started exploring it because I was dubious, because I work with the sciences and was afraid people would perceive it as theory-driven and irrelevant. Instead, I found it resonated really well with a lot of scientists and led to really engaging and delightful conversations that let us go beyond find 3 peer-reviewed articles into the whys and how comes. So again, going beyond that content and really analyzing and evaluating why we're using these sources and what makes them authoritative. So this next slide here kind of goes into the knowledge practices, and these are straight from the ACRL framework for authority is constructed and contextual. And again, the framework does not provide any learning outcomes, but instead these knowledge practices are similar to what students should develop in terms of skill sets related to this frame. So learners who are developing their information literate abilities, and I'm going to read these individually, should define different types of authorities such as subject expertise, societal position, or special experience. They should use research tools and indicators of authority to determine the credibility of sources. They should understand that many disciplines have acknowledged authorities in the sense of well-known scholars and publications that are widely considered standard, and yet even in those situations, some scholars would challenge the authority of those sources. So again, looking at the other side of the story, considering the missing information. They should recognize that authoritative content may be packaged formally or informally and may include sources of all media types. So again, going beyond the peer review, you know, maybe looking at raw data sets instead. They acknowledge they are developing their own authoritative voices in a particular area and recognize the responsibilities this entails, including seeking accuracy and reliability, respecting intellectual property, and participating in communities of practice. And lastly, they understand the increasingly social nature of the information ecosystem, where authorities actively connect with one another and sources develop over time. So we see this a lot in research, right, with citing articles. So other articles lay the foundation, and then other newer researchers on that foundation. So it's all part of this content structure, but also contextually with authority.
So all of this sounds great, right? But there are some challenges with the frame. And in fact, librarians were some of the earliest opponents of the ACRL framework for information literacy and education in higher education because it is not prescriptive. They don't prescribe specific learning outcomes to assess. So some would say that the frame is too fluid, it's too broad, it leaves too much room. But instead, we have to translate the frame's knowledge, practices, and dispositions to our own specific learning outcomes for our institutions. And some would say, well, that allows for a lot of freedom and customization as well. So it can be a good thing. Not all information is good information, so this can be a huge challenge with this frame. Like we said earlier, students, especially digital natives, may say that all opinions are valid. They're getting information from a variety of sources, and they're just unable to make that differentiation. So there can be the case of misplaced authority, because if someone else believes it, then we believe it as well. And we see this in commercial advertising as well. You know, celebrities who are advertising products like Proactive, or the one I see all the time on Facebook is that FabFitFun box they try to make you buy with all the different stuff inside. So it's leading us to they have authority on these products when in fact they probably don't. Another challenge is scholarly sources may present skewed points of view that privilege Western culture or other dominant or mainstream ways of thinking. And I do have an example here. We used her quote a little bit earlier. Valerie Nye, she's actually a librarian or the library director at a tribal college library. And she says that they have a very solid collection of books on Native history and culture. And these are from very reputable publishers and scholars. But she knows, and the students tell her, that a lot of these are written by outsiders and don't necessarily accurately depict their own experiences within this culture. So there can be inaccuracies in these books, even though they are the dominant authority based on who the publisher is and the author. So that's something we definitely have to consider. The frame assumes that authority should be contested, which is good. We shouldn't just accept all things. But some researchers have pointed out that this is actually a difficult concept for some international students who come from government or countries with authoritarian social and political systems. And not just those international students, but, you know, a student that just thinks more in black and white. You know, yes, it's good. Yes, it's bad. Yes, it's published, so it's good. Can have a hard time with contesting authority. Questioning authority is not necessarily a sign of disrespect. And I think Julia Bordeaux, she's an instruction librarian at Red Rocks Community College, sort of summarizes it, that teaching students to apply a critical lens to scientific authority and question established standards without undermining science can feel fraught. So it is definitely a challenge. Finally, The ACRL framework and other models of information literacy, since this isn't the only model of information literacy, they might not extend fully into the types of blended information and digital literacies required of scholars doing original research, such as doctoral students. And that quote comes from Ince, Hoadley, and Kirshner. So I thought that that was important, especially as it relates to NCU students.
So a couple of other challenges with the frame. Again, as researchers, we have to be aware of our own biases. So in terms of defining confirmation bias, Al-Thubaidi defines it as making a decision based on a person's preconceptions, beliefs, or preferences, and can also result from ignoring or overlooking opposing evidence. So again, as researchers, we must recognize that we might lean on sources and or data that support our own existing views on a subject. So again, this is very important when we're thinking about the context of the information using. And one example that they provide is that confirmation bias is one of the main reasons for diagnostic errors and may cause inaccurate diagnoses and improper treatment management in medicine. So the authors goes on to state that researchers should be encouraged to evaluate evidence objectively, taking into account contradictory evidence and alter perspectives through specific education and or training programs. So again, it's very important for us to recognize our own biases and then think about the context of the information in which we're defining or assigning authority to. And then we kind of go through other challenges with data collection and evaluation. And this is an article that Andrea Jones-Roy, professor of data science at NYU, elaborated on, and she stated that just as we want to analyze things carefully with statistics and algorithms, we also need to collect it carefully too. This doesn't mean throw out data. It means that when we include evidence in our analysis, we should think about the biases that have affected their reliability. We should not just ask, what does it say, but ask who collected it, how did they do it, and how did those decisions affect the results. So again, some additional questions to consider when we're evaluating authority. What might be missing from this picture? What's another way to consider what happened? And what does this particular measure rule in, rule out, or incentivize? So again, going beyond the content and thinking about the context of that information. So this next slide provides 5 different ways that we can attribute authority, but in the author's discussion, Kuchlik and Bordeaux, we see that these methods are not entirely sound and cannot be individually relied upon. So we often rely on peer review sources, which is a baseline level for establishing authority, but that can also be fallible. And the authors point out that while it is important to relay the rigor linked to the peer review process to students, that we must recognize that mistakes do creep in. And some of the examples include publishing of incorrect data or the use of a faulty instrument for that research. And then we should also consider the amount of time it takes for an article to complete the peer review process. So in cases where innovative information is being published, we might want to consider a peer review conference presentation as opposed to a journal article, just because of the length of time it takes for that information to be vetted. We also talk about authorship roles. So, who is writing this piece of work? Who is the author? But in cases where there are multiple authors within a paper, who is actually responsible for the work as a whole? Do all authors have a full understanding of the work? So again, something to consider when looking at authors. We can also go by citation patterns. So, ideally, if a work has been highly cited in the literature, then that usually leads us to think that it is a reputable source. But in this case, high citation rates can be misleading. Although they may be the foundation of a field, they might have become, essentially passé in practical terms. And, sometimes they're highly cited because many authors disagree with the content that's being presented. So again, question the number of citations. We also have to consider alternatives to the journal articles. So, consideration of other sources, perhaps direct products of research such as data sets, and other sources that establish a foundation of knowledge. So when it comes to certain fields or industries, there might be encyclopedias or handbooks that set that baseline for a topic. And the last point here is, the authority beyond the academy. So describing how authority is viewed in other intellectual cultures. So, there is practicing the knowledge of practicing professionals and that level of authority versus published knowledge, that has been generated by researchers. So ultimately, these strategies are helpful in defining authority, but they're not absolutes in establishing authority. So something for us to all consider when we're looking at different resources.
So I'm sure you'll all find all of these research studies very, very interesting, just like we do. But what does it mean? Ultimately, what does it mean for you, right, as faculty members? Basically, it comes down to incorporating assignments that allow our students to practice evaluating authority, right? And many assignments will include multiple different aspects, not just focus on authority, but we did include a couple of example assignments that you can use that focus more so on the authority concept. I do encourage you to reach out to the library team, and we also have our instructional design librarian who's primarily responsible for working with the curriculum, and customize these ideas for your particular course. But some of the examples we include here are providing two articles. Maybe they're both scholarly, maybe one's popular and one's scholarly, with opposing viewpoints. Have the students evaluate the author's authority based on education, experience, publication record, most recent publication, years in the field, etc. And this is a really good opportunity to introduce various library search techniques like searching by author in our Roadrunner search, using Google Scholar to find the number of citing articles, etc. You could provide students with a list of people who have an interest in a particular discipline or topic and ask them to rank those people, whether they're researchers or others, from most authoritative to least authoritative. You could have them locate a social media post on a recent controversy or news item and have them evaluate that author's authority. Does that format, the social media format, influence their level of authority? And what about who's commenting on this post? Do they have any authority for stating their opinions or their information on that post? You can also have them evaluate that, anyone making comments. Finally, we see a lot of annotated bibliography assignments, which is great practice for students and helps them get ready for that thesis or dissertation. But when it comes to the annotated bibliography assignment, you could also include a reflection component. So why did you choose the sources that you did? How did you evaluate the authority of the sources? And I also have another example here. Rachel McMullen from Westchester University has actually created a rubric specifically for this frame. Authority is constructed and contextual. So the font here is a little bit small, but basically we do have a link to this rubric in our information literacy LibGuide, which we will present the link to at the end of this presentation. She has 2 outcomes for this research paper rubric, and that is students will be able to select sources whose authority is appropriate to the research topic and assignment parameters, and also students will be able to incorporate multiple and conflicting perspectives. So again, we have a link to this rubric, and Rachel has given us permission to distribute this. She's happy that it is being used.
So the next set of slides will present some of the NCU library tools and strategies to help with establishing authority. And again, these may be more along the lines of defining the content, whether the content is authoritative, but we need to still move on and think about the why is it authoritative, the context of the information. But this first slide here is conducting an author search in Roadrunner, and Roadrunner is our main search feature on the library's homepage, and it searches the majority of the library's content all at once. So by using the AU author field code, you as well as students can enter an author's name and search all of the works that are presented by that author within this interface. So again, one way to kind of establish the author's authority in the sense of, how many articles have they written, what kinds of topics have they written about. The next slide here is for a database tool called Ulrich's Web. So this can be accessed from our A to Z databases list. And the tool actually allows you to identify refereed or peer-reviewed journals. So by simply conducting a search on the title of the journal or by searching by the ISSN number, you can see whether or not a journal or a resource rather is peer reviewed. And you can tell by this little icon that looks like a referee t-shirt. So in this case, Reference and User Services Quarterly, which is published by the American Library Association, is a peer reviewed journal based on the icon associated with that specific title. The next slide here covers Web of Knowledge. This is another database which is accessed from our A to Z databases list. And what's unique about this database is that you can search different topics, search different authors, and you can filter by the time something has been cited. You can identify citation rates, and it's a great tool for also locating seminal works. If you'd like to learn more about this particular database, we do have a recurring live library event that happens each week called Am I Done? A deep dive into finding more research with Web of Knowledge. So definitely check that out if you have an interest in working with this particular database and going beyond some of the resources that we have. The next slide here covers citing articles in Google Scholar, and this is basically a technique to help you trace resources that have cited an original article. And more information about citing articles is available through our library guide page here, and it does cover different strategies to use within some of our other databases. But by copying and pasting a citation in the Google Scholar box, you're able to see how many times a particular resource has been cited, and you can click on that link and it will give you a list of the resources that have cited that particular article, that original article. You can also conduct an author search within Google Scholar. So by going to this link here, you can search an author and kind of see this profile, if you will, with titles that they've published, along with a citation graphic in terms of how many times they've been cited. So it's another way to kind of help students view authority and establish authority for different authors. And there's also a tool called Microsoft Academic, and actually Amanda shared this with me, and I'm really excited about this tool. It helps you locate research published by top topics, top authors, top institutions, and top journals. So you're able to go to academic.microsoft.com, and again, you can dump anything in the search box, but what's nice is that there's listed top authors, listed top institutions, and ideas for top topics. So again, another way for students to kind of research areas of interest and see, you know, who might be considered as established authorities within that field. And then our last tool/strategy before we end our presentation with some other resources is our research process LibGuide. So our research process LibGuide is very comprehensive, and it actually covers most, if not all, facets of the ACRL framework. So this outlines important steps in the research process, and it does cover topics such as evaluating information and more information. You can view more information at our research process LibGuide link here.
So in addition to those library resources, we do want to highlight a couple of online resources that relate to the ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education. One is called Quora, and Quora is the community of online research assignments. It's a collaborative space for adapting and experimenting with research assignments and sharing the success or lessons learned so that others may benefit. And the interesting thing about Quora, and you can see it in this image here, is that you're able to browse assignments by frame, discipline, education level, and whether or not it's for an individual or a group. So I did some playing around, and if we limit it to authority is constructed and contextual, frame 1, and we limit it to graduate, master's, and doctoral, and we limit it to individual versus a group, I think we get about 8 example assignments or so, somewhere around there. But people are constantly contributing to this. So you can always go online there and grab something and see, you know, is this something that works for my class, or is this something I can modify? Again, you're welcome to reach out to us to help customize these. And the ones in Quora, it's open access, so they're able to be shared, these resources. You're able to grab them for yourself. Most assignments I did want to mention, and this relates to this tool as well, most assignments that are included in these tools, they cover multiple frames. In other words, it's not that that assignment is only measuring authority. Very few of them will measure only one frame, if that makes sense. So this next tool is sort of similar. This is the ACRL framework for information literacy sandbox. It allows for searching, browsing, and contributing to a repository of materials related to the framework. And it's similar to Quora in that you may browse resources by resource type. So there's not only assignments here, there's also curriculum maps, rubrics, tutorials, etc. So it's a really rich resource. But you can narrow by resource type, discipline, type of institution, scope, and Creative Commons license. So these are not necessarily all able to be shared. You would look at that Creative Commons license to see if you can recreate that you know, exact assignment. If nothing else, it will give you ideas, but it is a sharing platform, so I would think most of them can be used. So these are the tools that we wanted to highlight. Again, all of the tools and all of the researchers that we have cited will be included on our information literacy LibGuide, which you see on this slide.
Yep, and again, for more information about the ACRL framework and information literacy, you can visit our library guide. So like Amanda said, it does include a list of resources that we've used throughout this presentation, along with links to those sample assignments, those studies, a lot of the tools that we mentioned. And then again, if you are interested in learning more about inclusion of these resources or concepts into your course, again, please feel free to reach out to any of the library staff, or you can schedule an instructional design consultation through our library guide here. So there will be a request an ID consultation tab located on this page. And that, I think, wraps up the content that we have prepared for you all. So thank you all so much for being here with us today. Again, we hope you all feel like you're authorities on this topic, authorities on authority.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for being here today. We have about 10 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box. I know that I learned a lot, and I think I'm actually going to share this presentation with our curriculum directors as they're constantly working with our SMEs to update our courses. I feel like this would be a valuable resource for them. And I do want to add that Dr. Coleman added excellent questions when you were going over the different activities and assignments in courses. And that was what I thought as well. I was like, you know what, as a student, this would be really helpful. So that made me think, I'm going to share this with the curriculum directors.
Sounds like a great plan.
Let's see here. I don't see any other questions coming through. We do have about 10 minutes left. So if I don't see any other questions come in the next minute or two, I will give everybody some time back to your day. Just a reminder, this session was recorded and I will have it posted in the faculty resource area by the end of today, along with the PowerPoint presentation that Marisha and Amanda used today. Just a few more seconds to see if any other last minute questions come through. I don't see any, so it doesn't look like we have any additional questions or comments. Marisha and Amanda, thank you both so much for your time today. Like I said, I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure the attendees learned a lot as well. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.